Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening. I'm so happy to have you all here. Ambassador Hachigian, I'm so happy to see your face and have you here as well. Before I get into introducing myself and the ambassador, I want to welcome you to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta's March Members Forum, the State Department in Atlanta, Understanding Subnational Diplomacy. And so before I introduce ourselves, I want to share a little bit about our incredible group, about you all that are joining us right now. So just bear with me. I want to kind of shout a couple of groups out, so to speak. So we have concerned citizens from several southern cities across the region, a couple of people from New York City and from other countries. We have representatives from the Mayor's Office of Atlanta and from the Department of Economic Development of Georgia. Consular offices are represented. We have people from the C-suite, CEOs and CFOs from Atlanta-based international companies, educators, students from 3 or 4 of the universities here. We have judges with us, members of the appellate judiciary, foreign judiciaries, and retired judges here. We have folks from the Truman Center for National Policy here. We have current and former ambassadors, diplomats in residence, one from Spelman here tonight, global consulting companies. We have partners and attorneys from major law firms here, the Carter Center. We have a great group. So I want to welcome each and every one of you here tonight. And thank you for joining us. I'll introduce myself and then we'll get right to it. Our main guest tonight is, of course, the ambassador. I am a historian and senior counsel at Gordon Reese, a national law firm where I solve business problems and resolve business disputes. I am teaching and earning a PhD in history through an assistantship at Georgia State University. I have certificates in international relations and international and comparative law from the University of Florida. And I hope to use all of this experience in a career transition to work in diplomacy and also teach college and graduate students interdisciplinary classes focused on history, the law, and foreign affairs. So enough about me. Let me introduce you to Ambassador Nina Hachigian. Ambassador Hachigian is the first U.S. representative for city and state diplomacy. Before rejoining the department, she served as the first deputy mayor for international affairs for the city of Los Angeles. In that role, she oversaw efforts that sent underserved community college students on free educational international trips. She created a new public-private partnership to attract international business and nonprofits, especially to underserved communities. And she prepared the city for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games and their legacy, and many, many other things. Before that, from 2014 to 2017, she served as the second U.S. ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And before that, earlier in her career, she was a senior fellow and senior vice president at the Center for American Progress, focused on Asia policy and U.S.-China relations. So welcome, Ambassador. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you. I'm doing good. It's great to be with you and such an illustrious crowd. Thank you. I'm honored.
Yes. Well, good. I agree. I had to shout a couple of people out because I was so impressed by who we have joining us. So I appreciate you letting me do that. Before we get into our first question, I wanted to really just share a basic definition of subnational diplomacy, and then we can really get right into it. So subnational diplomacy is broadly defined as the conduct of external relations undertaken by official representatives of cities and states with other actors, whether it be other cities and states, other nation states, or other foreign actors, NGOs or corporations. So that's the basic kind of working definition we have here tonight. So I want to kind of turn back kind of the clock a little bit to 2019, June 2019, when the City and State Diplomacy Act was introduced by Senators Chris Murphy and David Perdue. That is when this kind of the formal term subnational diplomacy kind of came on my radar a bit more. So that was introduced in June 2019. Then fast forward in October 2022, that is when your appointment was announced as our first special representative of subnational diplomacy. Now, kind of before all of this started, in the last 5 to 10 years, we were hearing rumblings about diplomacy is in trouble. Is city and state diplomacy the future of US foreign diplomacy? So why was your unit created now? This feels different. Why now?
Good question. And let me say thank you again. And thank you for all that all of you do to enhance US foreign relations. I think every citizen has a role that they can play. And I think it sounds like you're playing them. So thank you for that. So I would say 3 factors. But before I tell you my thinking of what they are, so subnational diplomacy is a sort of term of art, and I think you've defined it well. My initial title was the Special Representative for Subnational Diplomacy, but I found as I was meeting mayors and governors that it was not clear that my title was connected to their work. So I've now changed it to what you said earlier, which is I'm the Special Representative for City and State Diplomacy, which just makes it clearer. But to be clear, also, we work with counties, we work with towns, we work with rural areas. So, but we just needed something that, was a little bit short. So anyway, that's on the definition and on my title. So I think, like I said, I think there's 3 reasons why now. So the first is that the world feels like it's getting even smaller. And COVID reminded us of that. Americans are constantly being influenced and affected by things that are happening overseas. Climate change, economic inequality, defending democracy,
Yes.
all the way to sort of delivering innovative solutions. And all of that is work of mayors and governors. They're on the front lines of addressing all of those challenges. As Secretary Blinken said when he addressed the U.S. Conference of Mayors earlier this year, that cities are where challenges tend to emerge first and where solutions are forged the quickest. So that's one reason. The second is that this administration is particularly dedicated to a foreign policy for all Americans. Foreign policy for the middle class is a term you may have heard, and President Biden made that a priority from the get-go. And then finally, you mentioned the legislation, and that was part of it, but also mayors asked for this role to be created. They wrote letters and presented them to Secretary Blinken and others. And so I think that was maybe the third reason.
No, I love that foreign policy for all Americans. That's something that I think really resonates, because one of the issues that a lot of cities and states have is getting funding for their international affairs departments and their international work, and whether it be trade or what have you. And so I think that if you have from the beginning the mindset of that this is for all Americans, this isn't just for a privileged few that get to kind of travel overseas for work or what have you, then I think that really can help kind of reach everyone. So I love that. And so I wanted to ask you about kind of your unit is charged with doing quite a lot. One of the things is tapping into diplomatic innovation seen and incubated at the municipal level. And so one of the things you mentioned that I guess Secretary Blinken said is the problems and the solutions are often found at that local level. Can you give us a little bit of your vision and your plans for kind of tapping into these innovations and kind of dispersing what you learn?
Sure. Why don't I step back first and just sort of give you the 3 main roles? I'll do it quickly of how we're defining our 3 main roles at the State Department. So first is trying to bring the benefits of foreign policy to the local level. So that could be helping with an economic opportunity, helping business visas get processed more quickly, or connecting local communities with the plentiful youth exchange opportunities that the State Department has and not everybody knows about. Second would be to support and encourage U.S. local leaders to engage internationally. Like we were saying earlier, our mayors and governors are increasingly working on transnational issues, and we want their solutions shared at an international level. They also may, want to lead a trade delegation to bring business back to their communities. And then third, it's to be a resource for our colleagues all over the world to, encourage them to look at their own local leaders in whatever country they're stationed in. Many of them, or often they go on to become even heads of state. That's a very normal path in other countries to go from being a mayor to a head of state. But there are also certain issues like climate change where local officials have a lot of power over, the building codes and how efficient buildings have to be, and public transportation, and how the garbage is taken away, or how the garbage is then processed, which has a huge effect on climate change, as well as like the power grid. So anyway, those are our three big missions. So you asked a more specific question about taking the innovation at the local level and bringing it to the State Department. So we've had a couple of teams who are negotiating international agreements coming to us and saying, we're negotiating this international agreement on pandemics. We really need to understand what, the experience and the lessons of mayors and governors during COVID, for example. And there have been others. So that's, one way in which we're doing it. And then there are certain programs where we connect up local American cities with counterparts overseas to share technical expertise on some aspect of sustainable development, for example. So that's another way we're doing it. And we can talk about the City Summit of the Americas if you want. That's a big way that we're going to be doing it at the end of April.
Yes, actually, I did have a question about that because I know that you plan to attend. And so if you could share a little bit about what that is, because I think it is related to the question. So yeah, if you could share a little bit about what that is and what your plans are when you go to the summit next month.
Yeah, it's coming up soon. So this is the first time the State Department has ever done this, as far as I know. And so we're hosting a cities summit, and it's of the Americas. So it's an outcome that came out of the Summit of the Americas. So all the entire Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean. So Central America, South America, Canada, Caribbean, mayors from all those places coming to Denver. And we have about 2,000 participants at the moment, around 200 mayors that are going to attend. And so we're going to launch one of these programs, like the one I just mentioned, to connect cities with their counterparts in the Americas to work on peer-to-peer learning and connection around resilience and sustainability. And then in general, we have a whole bunch of sessions dedicated to peers sharing with each other, but State Department folks will be there too to listen. So it's going to be fun and interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And I believe Atlanta is going to be sending participants, so we'll be happy to welcome you there.
Wonderful. That 2,200 mayors, my goodness. You can be, hopefully you have like some, PTO time after that, like maybe one day after that. And so that actually, you mentioned kind of a group, mayors, and that's kind of one of the kind of subnational groups that have been getting together and doing work for decades now. And really, forging some foreign policy on their level. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you plan to navigate some of these older, decades and decades old subnational relationships? How do you plan to do that?
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction is that, it's possible we'd want to take advantage of some of them if everyone was amenable to that. But, unless somebody needs our advice or our help, we don't need to be engaged. We're happy for that to just, those relationships just to, to go on as they are. You mentioned that, mayors have been getting together, and it's true, they've been doing it just bilaterally, with one on one in the case of like a sister city arrangement or what have you. But they've also organized themselves in networks. So there are many global networks of mayors dedicated. There's two at least dedicated to, well, three if you count also states dedicated to climate change.
Yes.
There's one dedicated to gender equity. We started that one in Los Angeles. There's one on resilience. There's another on combating violent extremism. And there's another one on migration. So there's lots of them. And when they are together, they, again, they're sharing lessons and all that about what, what's working in their city, but they're also they're a much bigger voice than they would be, individually.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask you, I believe you and Secretary of State Blinken actually spoke at one of the conferences of mayors, maybe in January or something like that. Can you share a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. That was at the annual meeting of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So that's a U.S.-based network. Right. And there's many in the U.S. too. There's the National Governors Association, Lieutenant Governors Association, National League of Cities, National League of Legislators. And this was the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And for the first time, the Secretary of State gave an address to that meeting. First time ever in history, which is interesting when you think about, because the Secretary of Transportation and Labor and many other cabinet secretaries are always there, but the Secretary of State has never been there until now. And so that was, I don't know, for me, kind of a watershed moment that just symbolizes how we're in a different place now.
I agree. I think so. When I read that, I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever seen this reported before. So thank you for kind of giving us a little bit more insight on that. Kind of a little bit related, and especially related to your experience as Deputy Mayor of International Affairs for the City of Los Angeles. So you know very well and you respect the work that cities and states do and the international relations work that they do. And so I want you to kind of share with us a little bit of kind of what is the value add that your unit brings. I think I know the answer based on what you said about the three roles and what you kind of mentioned with the summit, but can you kind of some people are kind of talking about, well, is this too much bureaucracy? Well, what's the value add? What does that unit bring to the table? So if you can talk to those folks for us.
I will just share the funny thing that occurred to me when you said that, which is like, I kind of wish that we were big enough to be a bureaucracy, We're a very small, nimble team.
Lean.
But it's a position that mayors lobbied for. And I think it's because, for many cities and states, they want to do things internationally, but they don't have the funding to have dedicated staff or certainly not a large team. Atlanta has one of the biggest in the country, if not the biggest, tied with New York. But many cities, there's 20,000 municipalities in the United States. And, I've got to say that 99.9% of them do not have, dedicated international staff. So that's what we're for. We're here to answer questions, to, resolve conflicts that their businesses might be having overseas, potentially to provide advice about, where might be a good city for them to engage with, or a good state or region or province that matches their own interests, a given set of interests. So we're really, just trying to support them. Over time, we hope to also support them with capacity, but that's a tall order, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. Because I think that's what, certainly as deputy mayor, that's what I would have liked. But even as, even me, and having been an ambassador, there's still lots of the world I don't know about. So it would be great to be able to just know that, okay, this is my front door. Mm-hmm. What are my talking points if I'm going to be talking to the opposition leader from Belarus? Like, what is our policy? And
Right.
now I know what a policy is, but probably there may have been times in the past where I didn't know what it was. So
Yeah.
that kind of thing. That's how, and there are other parts of the State Department that also are interfacing with mayors and governors. And it's perfectly fine to work with them as well. The Office of Foreign Missions, for example, has 5 offices around the United States. And so it doesn't really matter which door you use, but we're the ones dedicated to mayors and governors and county executives and the like.
Well, thank you for that. I
Yeah.
think that answers a lot of those kinds of questions that I'm sure come up and that people are thinking about. I want to, before I open up the floor to our friends on the webinar to ask some more questions, I want to ask you about Atlanta specifically. So Atlanta is dynamic, and their yearning and posturing for international connections is kind of been here since the 1895 expedition. Like this has been something that Atlanta has wanted and is prepared for, since the Olympics. And then now we have a mayor who is attuned to city and state diplomacy. He's on a task force for, the Truman national policy. So Atlanta is prepared to be and wants to be and is on that international stage. I want to talk to you about the difference maybe in relationships with cities like in Atlanta or Los Angeles, and maybe smaller cities like where I'm from, Pensacola or Athens. How do you treat those cities differently if you do, and how specifically do you plan to engage with Atlanta?
Yeah, so we take our cues from the cities and or states themselves about what they want to do, what their ambitions are. And then depending on what they tell us, we help in different ways. So it could be that a smaller city, it doesn't really know where to begin when they're going to take their first, trip overseas, or they have, new refugees who have arrived and want to know like something about their homeland or what have you. It could be, I was talking to a mayor from Florida who's what they do internationally is horse shows. Like that's what their one big international thing is a horse show. So that's a different conversation than with Atlanta, for example. And Atlanta has one of the most experienced, largest, and most sophisticated international affairs teams, led by Vanessa, who's terrific and a friend. And we worked together when I was deputy mayor of LA. And I just have absolutely no, doubt whatsoever that she will do whatever is right for Atlanta. And she also knows who to call if she does need help, and that's us. And so it's, it's a pretty easy relationship, I would say. We will no doubt call on her and her mayor at times to help us, in putting out a message to other mayors or in showing other cities, how, what the benefits are of doing this or what have you. But I think our relationship will very much go both ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. And their team there and the team with the Georgia Department of Economic Development, they're great as well. And I mean, it is a unique place in the sense that all the types of diplomacy exist here. There's sports diplomacy, health diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy. So we got a lot going on here. And so I'm happy to hear that there's a great relationship there. And so I'm going to open the floor to some questions. Everybody, please send in more questions, but I'll start with a question from Mark Elgart. What role can schools, domestic and international, play to support city and state diplomacy?
Thanks, good question. I would say the first thing is to just educate your students about the fact that cities and states are doing all these things, that they are hosting heads of state, and they are signing MOUs with countries and other cities, and that they're cooperating on climate change, and that they're attending, the big climate change negotiations every year and all that. So I would say that's number one. And then number two, that there's a career there, which is another important piece. And then the other part I would say is making sure they have knowledge and access to all the international exchange opportunities that there are. And those can be ones that are run through the State Department, or just there's others, and making sure that the students have a chance even to travel overseas, because I think there's kind of no substitute for that. You mentioned in my intro about starting the program for community college students, and none of them would have been able to go if not for this free program. For a good 35% of them, it was their first time on an airplane. And we got passports and did all the briefings and all that stuff. So and I think and then one of them went on to work at the State Department, I found out by accident. And another one spent 6 months in Dubai as a US representative at the World's Fair. So many of them, that trip, 10-day trip, was really a pivot for them in their lives. So anyway, those are just some ideas.
No, I love that. And those kinds of experience can be very much life-changing. I know that you recently did go to the South by Southwest EDU and talked about pathways for global affairs on college campuses. And so I don't know if you could share a little bit about kind of the remarks that you gave there, or just some of the insight that you provided there, if you can.
Sure. I would say that the most important thing is the website address, which is exchanges.state.gov, and they're all listed there. But we talked about how, it is so important for the State Department to look like America, and we have a ways to go in terms of recruitment in more, in all kinds of different diversity that are not represented as they should be at the State Department. And so we are particularly making an effort to push these exchange, deadlines and notices and whatever to underserved communities that, wouldn't maybe otherwise know about them, in hopes that that first taste, whether it's with an internship or whether it's an exchange program or whatever it is, will then, lead to an interest in this field and maybe even a career.
That would be ideal. Like some of your friends that have already moved, started at the State Department, right? Great pathway there. Okay, well, Jerry Stiplin has a question. How will you know if the program is successful? Is it measurable, and in what time frames?
Such a good question. So I can answer that in one way, which is that I am trying to hire a data scientist. It's taking a little while, but I am determined to bring one onto my small team. And that person's job will be to do exactly what you're asking, to measure the progress. In the meantime, we're doing a little bit of measuring, which is like because at this stage, we're really about outreach. So how many mayors are we connecting with? How many governors are we connecting with? How many international, interlocutors are we connecting with? So we're measuring all of that stuff. And how many State Department colleagues are we assisting, and how, so we're measuring that, but, and that is a significant mandate of ours, is to be that connective tissue. But there's part of me that doesn't like measuring just essentially meetings. So we're going to look forward trying to also measure the outcomes, which is much harder, but that's why I'm hiring a data scientist.
Good. Well, I wish you all the best in your hiring.
Thank you.
Maybe all of these, tens and tens of thousands of tech folks are losing their positions. So maybe that you can gain from some of that bad news, maybe. Okay, I have a question that was written in by Byron Stokes. How do we ensure counties and rural populations recognize the importance of diplomacy? So this is more about, some of the less urban. Yeah.
So we talked to counties. So we actually recently presented, I think it was last week, to the National Association of Counties. So that's one way that we're getting the word out. I've definitely talked to, there's one really interesting coalition of cities along the Mississippi River, many of whom are from rural towns. They are really interesting. They are like, there's about 100 cities, and they are, across, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 states that are together, forging what they call, what's called like a nature-based solution to prevent flooding of the Mississippi. So they were at COP. They were represented at the big climate conference in Egypt last year. So anyway, so we're engaging with them, and some of them clearly know that this is important to them. And I've got a relatively small team, so we can't, we're trying to every way we can to figure out how to message across. Some of it might come through governors, who we are also able to reach, and hope that it trickles down from there as well. But any ideas you have, I'm all yours.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that is, it's interesting, the position that kind of Atlanta is in, and the connection that cities like that have. It's able to punch above its weight a lot of times, not just because of the metro area, but because of some of the kind of rural counties that surround it. And so they're an important part of the conversation.
It's a good thought too, though, is to connect to cities that have those kinds of deep relationships.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question from Bruce. When the U.S. participates in forming policy about urban issues by international organizations such as UN Habitat, how can a city government best make their views known and offer input? So really, how can city governments get their input up and through to some of these big international organizations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say that right now, for cities in the United States, they should talk to my office, because I know who the people are in the State Department who are in charge of negotiating things with Habitat and going to the meetings and whatnot. So that is something that we can certainly help with. And you can either just write out your views and send them to us and we'll pass them along, or we can connect you to somebody to talk to.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have another question from Michael. It's a little bit of a comment and then a question. So he says that Ambassador Young used to brag that Atlanta won the Olympics because the IOC members didn't stay at the Ritz. They stayed with people from their own country in Atlanta. And I think that also speaks to the incredible diaspora that's represented here in Atlanta as well. How important is it to remind mayors and governors that international relations begins inside your own borders?
I think for the mayors and governors that I've talked to that have large diaspora communities, they're very aware of them, and engage with them regularly. I talked to one mayor and it's a small city that has like 11 languages spoken in the schools, or maybe it was more like 20 languages, just because of they've always accepted refugees. So the various waves of refugees that have come through over the last decades have created these whole communities. Anyway, that's a really kind of an extreme example, but it's true of all mayors and governors that I've spoken to. I don't know that they need reminding, because the diaspora communities remind them.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Those diaspora communities tend to be outspoken and very well connected to their countries of origin and to their communities where they are, it's such a beautiful thing always. I have one or two more questions, and I think then our time will come to a close, but I wanted to ask you, kind of looking into the future a little bit, a year, 2, 3, 4 down the line, where would you like for your unit to be, and what kind of work would you like for them to be doing? I know you're in the creating stage right now, and so that's you're doing the work, but then you're also creating. So it's
yeah,
quite a lot. So what do you see for your unit in the future?
Yeah, so kind of what success looks like. So I'd say a
Yeah.
few things. It's a good question that I should, spend more time thinking about than I've had so far. But I would say number one, that our office still exists, because we'll be in a different administration,
Yeah.
possibly by then, or maybe not. But in any case, that the next administration, whatever it is, whenever there's a president other than Biden, like hope that that person keeps our office, and the Secretary of State decides to keep our office. So that would be number one, I would say. Number two, that we are able to really move the needle on some issues, and that we internally have the capacity to do that. Climate change would be, a real example, like that we find, that we work really closely with Secretary Kerry's team, which we already do, but to actually, do the kind of convincing and connecting and supporting that it will take to have a mayor decide that, yes, they're going to pledge to be, net zero by 2040 or whatever, and then they actually do it. So that kind of thing. Similarly, with democracy, there's mayors and governors play a really important role in preserving democracy that I don't think is well understood. And so even just the awareness of that would be, I think, a real success for us. That we are able to solve problems, like, when we're able to tell the story of, 100 problems that we solved for different local leaders, that we have, I could just keep going and going, that we've that we've organized trips for subnational leaders to different places on different topics. All of that, will come with more experience and probably a slightly bigger capacity than we have now. But those are my dreams and hopes.
I think those are fantastic. And I think your number one is a great number one, to still be here, to still be here. And so let's close there. And I want to just close with some thank yous. First of all, thank you to Ambassador Hachigian for your time. This is something that I'm researching and working on. And so the fact that you said yes to coming to speaking to our group, I'm glad you said yes. Thank you for saying yes.
My pleasure.
And I also want to thank your team, Irina, for helping us to coordinate everything, and to Megan at the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Thank you so much for all of your help in putting this together. And then again, to our group for the night, all of you who have tuned in and zoomed in, thank you so much for being here and being interested in things like this. We're grateful, and I think it makes a difference.
I sure do too. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for your great questions and for spending some time with me. And, appreciate it, and hope next time it's in person.
I hope so too. That's the goal. That'll be our goal next time. But take care. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great night.